If I'm going to have to tell the story, then I'm going to have to start at the very beginning. Our story begins in Giles County, Tennessee, in the year 1900. It's here that a girl named Lucy Stanford was born into this world. From the very start, Lucy was dealt a hard road to hoe in this life. You see, she was actually the first of 2 children born out of wedlock and was the illegitimate daughter of Rosie Stanford, a young single mother who was trying her best to find her way in this brand new world at the turn of the 20th century. However, some things just aren't meant to be, and 3 short years after giving birth to Lucy, Rosa suffered a tragic accident when she had an epileptic seizure and fell into the fireplace of her home, where she was severely burned. After 3 agonizing days of suffering, Rosa succumbed to her burns and died just days before Christmas. This heartbreaking event left Lucy and her younger brother both fatherless and motherless at just 3 years young, and unfortunately, the next few years would be a whirlwind of guardianship changes. Initially, both kids were sent to live with Rosa's mother. However, her health was failing, and within 4 months of taking her grandchildren in, she too died. This resulted in an all-out custody battle between Rosa's 2 siblings, Dan and Maggie. Now, Dan strongly believed that both of the children should be kept together at all cost. However, Maggie had no kids of her own, and she wanted nothing more than a little girl that she could pamper. And truth is, Maggie was more than willing to adopt Lucy, but she wanted nothing to do with Lucy's brother. This resulted in an internal struggle between Dan and Maggie, which eventually landed in the court system. And when a judge awarded Maggie custody of both children, her reaction was far from elation. In fact, you might say it was downright chilling. On her way out of the courtroom, she bluntly told Dan that if she were forced to take that boy, she would see to it personally that he was done away with. The look on her face sent shivers down Dan's spine, and fearing for the boy's life, Dan finally relented. As hard as he had fought to keep the children together, Lucy was adopted by Maggie and Ryan was adopted by Dan. And as it turns out, the siblings would never see each other again. Yet, for all the turmoil that Lucy endured, she was a resilient child, and a pretty one too. True to her word, Maggie gave her adopted daughter the very best she could afford. She bought her expensive clothes and play pretties, and provided everything the growing girl needed. Lucy was highly intelligent, and even attended the finest school in the area once she was of age. And Maggie had no problem paying for it all. After all, she had a small fortune saved in the bank, and she owned her own house, which was full of high-end furniture and even a grand piano. But for all her possessions, it was Lucy who was Maggie's pride and joy. And as the years came and went, the two developed an inseparable bond that would last the rest of their lives. Well, anyhow, by early 1910, Lucy Stanford was 10 years old when Maggie began dating a man named William Cook, a farmer in rural Giles County, in an area that locals called Rock Springs. William and Maggie had a whirlwind romance, and although Maggie's Romeo didn't have much money, he sure was a smooth talker and a hopeless romantic. Heck, even a God-fearing church-going man. He almost seemed too good to be true. Yet, before long, this Casanova had swept Maggie off her feet, and by the time summer rolled around, the two lovebirds were stitched together as one, and Maggie moved into William's home in Rock Springs. But make no mistake about it, as much as the new bride loved her husband, she made it clear to him from the very beginning that no one came before the one thing she loved the most in this world, and that was Lucy. In fact, just days after the marriage, Maggie sold her home and secretly opened a separate bank account in her own name, and even wrote a will stating that in the event that anything ever happened to her, all of her money would be left to Lucy. Nonetheless, by 1913, William and Maggie Cook and their adopted daughter, Lucy Stanford, were living the perfect life. William turned out to be a devoted and hard-working husband who rose at 5 a.m. each day to work the crops and attend the farm animals. And Maggie, she was the picture-perfect wife and a social butterfly, keeping the house clean and providing for her small family and even volunteering down at the local church. Meanwhile, Lucy was 13 years old and the star student down at Cedar Grove School. In fact, Lucy was already an aspiring teacher herself, since many times she was allowed to lead and even teach the other students reading and math. To outsiders, not a single thing seemed out of place in this little slice of paradise. Everything was just right, down to the last detail. Yet, this illusion was about to be shattered and would rock all of Tennessee and one of the most diabolical whodunit mysteries in all of American history. It all started on August 25th, 1913. It had been a typical Monday at the Cook homestead. William had been busy harvesting corn while Maggie tended to the chores around the house. Lucy was in the best of spirits because she had even gotten to teach again down at the school. And by supper, William announced that he wanted to take the family down to the revival meeting at the Baptist church that was taking place in the nearby town of Smyrna. But Maggie, she decided that she would skip church that night and stay home with Lucy to help prepare her for the teaching lesson the next day. So, without any fanfare, William hitched his horse to the wagon and set out to the big meeting at the church. Now, I need to pause here for just a second, and I must warn you, the events that happen next have baffled investigators and historians to this very day. But one thing we know for sure is the exact timeline of events that were documented by eyewitnesses. Around 7:30 p.m., two neighbors, the Pruitt daughters, passed Mr. Cook as they were heading home. William inquired if the two girls would like to catch a ride with him to church, but they politely declined since their parents would be worried if they came home late. Now, the Pruitts were a large family who lived next door to the Cooks, and the two neighbors were closely knit and couldn't help but notice all the comings and goings of one another, especially since the driveway to the Pruitts' farm ran right beside William Cook's house. And once those Pruitt girls arrived home a few minutes later, they were startled when a flashlight was shined on their horses and then in the girls' faces before quickly being turned off. It had to have come from the outside of the Cook's house, which strangely had no lights on. It sure was curious, but the girls shrugged it off and went on inside for the night. 45 minutes later, at 8:15, Edward Pruitt was returning home on his horse when he too passed the Cook house. And as he passed the rear of the house, he noticed that a light was on in Lucy's bedroom, which had a door that opened up to the back porch. And that door was slightly cracked open, with light shining across the porch. But there was no sign of anyone. It struck Edward odd, and he even turned his head and studied the scene as he rode by. Meanwhile, down at the church, they had a mighty fine time, The meeting was greatly attended, and several people reported that they saw William sitting right in the front row with his Bible in his lap, fully engaged and staying until the entire service ended at 9 p.m. The ride from the church to the Cook farm was a solid hour, and around 10 p.m., William encountered Silas Pruitt, who was also on his way home. So he offered his neighbor a ride. "Silas, why don't you lighten up and come sit in my buggy? We can hitch your horse to the rear, and I'll give you a ride home the rest of the way." "No, sir, Mr. Cook. Ma is probably worried sick that I ain't home yet. I best be getting along." And with that, Silas overtook William and disappeared in the distance. By 10 p.m., William finally made it home. The entire place was dark, which wasn't that unusual given the late hour, but it sure was strange that the family dog, Coy, didn't run out to greet his master. But Mr. Cook was tired and ready for bed, so he decided to just tie his horse up in the front yard for the night instead of putting him up properly in the barn in the rear of the house. And then he made his way into the dwelling. It was dark inside. He was careful not to wake Maggie or Lucy as he made his way to the bedroom. Maggie wasn't in his bed, but it didn't raise any concern since she frequently slept in Lucy's room whenever William was out late at night. Now, the man of the house didn't even give it a second thought, and he simply pulled back the sheets and turned in for the night. The next morning came earlier than expected. You see, William normally had breakfast at 4 a.m., but this morning, for some reason, he didn't wake up until 7:30. And that sure was odd, especially since there was so much work to do in the fields. But it was better late than never, so the farmer got dressed and made his way through the kitchen towards the back porch. And there he was met with a grisly sight. Several pieces of furniture and a kerosene heater were overturned, and the kerosene smell was so strong that it burned William's eyes. He had to pull his shirt over his nose just to breathe as he slowly walked further. And then he saw it. There were smeared, bloody fingerprints and crimson splatters high on the walls, all over the entire room, and a huge trail on the floor as if a victim had been dragged through the house. William made his way further into the next room, and there was Maggie in a pool of red, lying motionless in the doorway leading to the back porch. She was dressed in her nightgown, and it was clear that there had been a desperate fight for her life. She had suffered several devastating blows to the head from some heavy object, cracking her skull and knocking several teeth out. Her arms were battered terribly, and several fingernails were missing, as she apparently had used them to shield herself from the attack. The horrified husband quickly ran out the back door screaming towards the Pruitt's house. "Come quick, something terrible has happened." Upon hearing the commotion, Mr. Pruitt and his two daughters ran frantically to the house. And once they arrived, the stench of death and kerosene was thick in the air. This wasn't a fresh crime scene. No, it was clear that Maggie had met her demise much, much earlier. But oh no, where was Lucy? Quick, go check her room. And that's when Mr. Pruitt's eldest daughter made her way through the house and down the dark hallway to Lucy's room, where she slowly turned the door handle and swung the creaking door open. Inside, another nightmare awaited. Once again, the walls and the ceiling were dripping in red, and there was Lucy lying still on her back with her eyes open on the floor. She too had suffered a savage beating by a blunt object. One thing was clear. Both women had been killed the day before. But exactly when did it happen? And what monster had committed the crime?
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
By 11 a.m., police investigators arrived with a team of bloodhounds to scour the area. But each trail the dogs picked up, it always led them in a circle before returning right back to the crime scene. By 11 a.m., police investigators arrived with a team of bloodhounds who scoured the area. But each trail that the dogs picked up on always led them in a circle before returning to the crime scene. Detectives searched every square inch of the house. Nothing appeared to be missing, not even Maggie's expensive collection of diamond necklaces and earrings that were worth thousands of dollars. They were still laid perfectly in her bedroom. This didn't appear to be a robbery. Inside Lucy's room, there were 17 bloody matches that were laying all around her body, as if the killer had spent a considerable amount of time standing over his victim and studying her. And just where was that murder weapon? The only clue was a large piece of hickory bark that was several inches long and stained crimson red and was laying next to Maggie. By the afternoon, police had set up a makeshift headquarters at a nearby general store where hundreds of locals had gathered to discuss every possible clue of the crime. That's when one man noticed the clean shirt that William Cook was wearing. And speaking of clean, fellas, would you just have a look-see at his hands? Have you ever seen a pair of hands that clean? Why, even his fingernails are freshly trimmed right down to the quick. It sure was curious. And that's when detectives insisted that William remove his clothing so they could examine his body. There were several deep scratches on his neck and one on his face, and all of them appeared to be fresh. But William insisted that he had got those scratches while working in the cornfield. All of this attention sure made William nervous and even downright evasive. Day 2 and 3 of the investigation yielded little new information, but by now, the details of the crime were front-page news as hordes of people began traveling to Rock Springs to get a first-hand look at the House of Horrors. Maggie and Lucy's funerals were held on the third day, where over 1,200 people attended the ceremonies as they were laid to rest side by side in a small cemetery just a few hundred yards from the place they were murdered. Meanwhile, police began digging deep into the backgrounds of both Maggie and William. Was it possible that there might just be a few skeletons lurking in their closets? Right away, Maggie's secret bank account and her small fortune of money caught the lawmen's attention. Just how had she managed to acquire this money? It was then that they discovered Maggie had in fact been married twice before. The first time was to a fella named William Thornton, who left Maggie after just a short month of being together. A few years later, Maggie married a man with the last name of Andrews, who mysteriously died and left everything he owned to her. Now, that might account for some of the money, but detectives were baffled as to how she owned multiple properties, several flashy watches, and extravagant gold and diamond jewelry. And that's when they found out that Maggie had a secret friendship with a well-known gambler, and she was a close friend with a woman who ran an assignment house. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is an assignment house? Well, back in the early 1900s, these were upscale mansions that rented out rooms to wealthy businessmen who just happened to need a few hours of rest. And wouldn't you know it, along with those rooms that the men had rented also included the services of a beautiful woman for the entire duration of their stay. Was it possible that Maggie was living a double life? Is that how she came into her fortune? Well, maybe. But those closest to Maggie contended that while she might have been friends with these shady characters, she never engaged in their illicit activities. And what about William Cook? Now, everyone knew that the Cook family had lived in Rock Creek for generations. But William, well, he had been a bit of a restless soul and had even spent a few years working in Nashville and Chicago as a railroad attendant before he eventually settled down and married Maggie. Now, he had never had much money, but curiously, detectives discovered that William had recently taken out 2 life insurance policies worth $20,000 each from Maggie and Lucy. And then there was the strange disappearance. It seems that Maggie's will, which stated that she would leave her fortune to Lucy, had suddenly vanished. As far as police were concerned, this seemingly perfect marriage had more secrets than Carter had liver pills. But what investigators needed was a break in the case, and that would come on the 4th day. Investigators had spent the entire morning scrutinizing the bed that William had slept in the night the crime was committed. How could he have possibly slept so soundly in a house that was full of kerosene fumes? And upon careful examination, several drops of blood were discovered on the very pillow that William had slept on, along with blood on the bed frame. Minutes later, a deputy called out from the back barn where he had found something hidden underneath a pile of straw, a peculiar piece of hickory that, strangely, all of the bark had been removed and was stained red. That's when one officer remembered the large piece of bark that he had found next to Maggie. And then the piece of bark was placed against the hickory club, and lo and behold, it was a perfect match. Police had found the murder weapon. It was then and there, acting on pure suspicion and circumstantial evidence, William Cook was arrested for the murder of Maggie and Lucy. But as for Cook, he simply looked the sheriff in the eye and coldly said, "Well, you might arrest me for the crime, but you mark my words, law dog, you'll never prove it." The stage was set for what would turn out to be one of the most extraordinary and fascinating trials in American history, and would leave the nation holding their breath and demanding justice for Maggie and Lucy. The Cook family promptly hired the most powerful lawyer in the county, where the prosecution spared no expense, bringing in experts and witnesses to build their case. For them, it was simple. William Cook had murdered his wife and his niece to seize control of her money and to cash out their life insurance policies. There was plenty of proof. The blood on his bed, his missing clothing from the night of the crime, the murder weapon hidden in his barn, and several blatant lies that police had caught him in. More than enough to prove that he committed the crime. But for the defense, it was all circumstantial at best. After all, what about the witnesses who had seen the mysterious flashlight on the property? And William had a rock-solid alibi that he was at the church the entire time. This crime was clearly a robbery attempt, but the prosecution swiftly countered. It clearly wasn't robbery because nothing was stolen, not even thousands of dollars worth of valuable diamonds. The battle lines were drawn, and the defense fought every single detail, tooth and nail, and wouldn't concede a single inch of evidence. They even disputed the authenticity of the murder weapon. They argued that it couldn't have inflicted the type of damage that was found on the victims. And on October 29th, in a stunning move, 35 days after their demise, the judge ordered the 2 bodies exhumed from their graves and re-examined. It was clear that the defense would stop at nothing to fight the charges. Back and forth, the trial raged on as the top legal minds and experts in Tennessee battled in front of a packed courtroom that spilled into the hallways and out onto the courthouse lawn. Folks in the crowd craned their necks, jostling for a better view, and frequently there were gasps that washed over the room each time a critical piece of evidence was introduced. Even during the recesses, folks in attendance would skip lunch and the bathroom just to remain in their seats out of fear of losing them. There wasn't a single person in the state of Tennessee who didn't have an opinion as to guilt or innocence. And by the time the closing arguments finally arrived, the defense delivered a powerful closing argument, which declared their client's indisputable innocence. But when the lead prosecutor took the floor and opened a cardboard box and pulled from it 2 blood-soaked nightgowns that the victims had worn on that fateful night, a silence and a rage washed over the crowd, with many members of the jury openly weeping as the prosecutor demanded justice from Maggie and Lucy. Finally, after a historic and emotionally charged trial, the fate of the defendant was now in the hands of the jury, which wasted little time and promptly returned with a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder of Maggie Cook and Lucy Stanford. Pandemonium erupted in the courtroom. Order! Order in the court! The judge demanded. But it was clear that even he too wanted vengeance, because even though Tennessee had just adopted a new law that stated that the death penalty must be carried out with the electric chair, the judge decided that that wasn't enough punishment for this heinous crime. Therefore, he sentenced William Cook to death by hanging. Justice was finally served, right? Well, not so fast, my friend, because this story is about to take a bizarre turn. If folks thought that William Cook's lawyers were done fighting, they hadn't seen nothing yet, because they immediately filed an appeal, and in March of 1914, they successfully convinced the Tennessee Supreme Court to grant their client a brand new trial. And a series of legal maneuvers delayed the next trial until February of 1915, where William Cook was tried for murder in 2 separate cases, one for Maggie and one for Lucy. But shockingly, both trials resulted in jurors who were divided on guilt or innocence. So both trials were declared mistrials. But the prosecution refused to stop fighting for justice and quickly filed paperwork for another murder trial. In the meantime, the defense was able to get William released on a $10,000 bond for the next 14 months, until the 4th trial for the murder of Maggie Cook took place in April of 1916, where Cook was once again convicted, this time of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But once again, the defense appealed to the Supreme Court, but this time the verdict was upheld. But the prosecution still wasn't done. They might have had a conviction for Maggie, but now they wanted one for Lucy. And on January 5th, 1920, William Cook faced his 5th trial, where he was sentenced to 21 additional years in prison for murder, which his lawyers promptly appealed to a 6th trial. But finally, the appeal failed and William Cook would spend the rest of his life in prison. Right? Well, surely he would. Right? Well, it seemed that way. That is, until the morning of January 16th, 1923. Nearly 10 years after the horrible murders of Maggie Cook and Lucy Stanford, Tennessee Governor Alf Taylor was emptying out his personal belongings on his last day as governor when William Cook's lawyers slid a petition for pardon across his desk. And with a simple stroke of a pen, Governor Alf Taylor pardoned William Cook for all his crimes and made him a free man. When William was released from prison in 1923, he quickly moved to Chicago, where he bounced around several small jobs, working as a barber, and even a gas station attendant. Yet, no matter where he went, he drove the finest cars and wore the most expensive clothing because he was finally awarded Maggie's estate and both life insurance policies. As for the crime, it became one of those stories that the old-timers simply said, well, we don't talk about that no more, hoping that it would eventually be forgotten. And it almost was, until I was contacted by Maggie and Lucy's family, and they absolutely believe that he got away with murder. What about you, my friend? Do you believe justice was served? What about the flashlight that was seen outside the Cook home on the night of the crime? Think about how fancy an electronic flashlight must have been in 1913. It was definitely something that would have caught someone's eye. Who was the person holding it? Were they the real killer? Or perhaps someone that William hired? Or was it all just a coincidence? Do you believe that William was innocent or guilty? Finally, I'd like to leave you with this thought. When William Cook died in Chicago in 1930, he left very specific instructions on his burial. You see, in his final wishes, his body was returned to Tennessee, where it was placed in an expensive solid copper coffin with instructions to bury it next to Maggie and Lucy in the same cemetery a few hundred yards away from where the crime had taken place. Folks who attended that burial said it was one of the most bizarre and haunting, eerie sights to see how that copper casket glowed in the sun. A truly haunting end to this story. Today, the cemetery where Lucy and Maggie and William are all buried has completely been forgotten about, and it took me weeks to find it in a wooded area just off of Interstate 24 in Smyrna, Tennessee, several hundred yards off of a road that is still named Rock Springs Road. As for the house where the murder took place, well, it mysteriously burned to the ground several years later. And today, in its place, there are dozens of cookie-cutter homes in a subdivision that is named Living Springs. But I tell you this, I'd be willing to bet money that not a single soul living there knows what really happened or what's buried beneath those grounds. Something to think about. Let me know what you think about this story in the comments below.